Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of mass deportation from the United States. Now, the President-elect Trump has and also the so-called border czar Tom Homan has made some pretty explicit sort of noises to the effect of they're going to go ahead with this mass deportation. Now, how far it goes, how effective it is, how sustainable it is, are they going to be able to wade through the gazillion court challenges that'll come up, that'll be taken to activist courts to shut it down, these sorts of things. It's going to be a major task, and let's see how it goes. Now, the number of illegals, nobody knows. I went back and noticed in 2011 or 2010, there was supposed to be approximately 10 to 11 million illegals in the United States, 2010. Now, since then, a minimum of 15 million have come through since 2010. Depends on whose numbers you look at. Let's reduce it down and say that over the last 4 years, approximately another 12 million comes. So an absolute bare minimum, absolute bare bones minimum. There are 23 million illegals in the United States at the moment. Now, other estimates say it's closer to 35 million, and I tend to think that's more likely to be the accurate number. But let's split the difference and say it's on or about 30 million, and that should give us a decent guide. And that's a lot of people. Now, of this 30 million, 6 million have committed crimes, or so it's alleged. Now, these crimes range from murder and that sort of stuff to theft, drunk under the influence, driving without a license or driving without insurance, those sorts of things. But there are 6 million people that are criminals and have active, as I understand it, active warrants out for their arrest. And now that shows how successful these people can be into sort of disappearing into their racial diaspora, that you can have that many, approximately 20% of all the illegals in the United States have criminal records and have criminal warrants out for their arrest. This is apart from illegally entering the country, for goodness sakes. And yet these warrants have been active for years, and for some reason they can't find these people. Now, the benefit of when you're going after a sort of a good straight white male middle class person is that you can find them. They've got a regular address, they've got a fixed address, they've got a job. You can find them very easily. It's absolutely effortless to find those evil fascist Nazis, because they live such regular lives, if you like. But when it comes to the illegals, it's very different. They live in large houses. They all many of them have the same name. Jose Garcia or something. There's millions of Jose Garcias, and the list goes on. So they just disappear into the bowels of their racial diaspora, maybe moving from house to house, living in places where 30 people live to a 3-bedroom, and so on. Yeah. So they live a very different lifestyle. They've got casual, sort of part-time, irregular jobs, itinerant sort of lifestyles in that sense. They get paid cash under the table. They work in takeout food shops and so on and so forth. Now, it's much more difficult to find those people when you want to. And again, the testament to that is that there's some in the order of 6 million warrants floating around for people that they can't find. So the sort of life they lead, the existence they lead, in the enclaves of ghettos of racial groups, other than dragnet type styles, it's much harder to find these people. So what can be done? Now, let's suppose they do get apprehended. Then there are many blue states, Democrat-run states, where the governors and the local city mayors and that sort of thing, they're running around being stunning and brave. We won't let any of these illegal. No human being is illegal. And so they're running around sort of all big and tough on that score. Then on the other side, you've got the globalist controlled financial press, the BlackRock type outfits, saying that Armageddon will descend on the US if all these are, because apparently not one bit of fruit can be picked, not one floor swept, or not one takeout chicken shop can function without all these illegals. I mean, what a load of nonsense. I don't know how anybody buys that. In the media, of course, the globalist controlled media parrot this as if it's gospel. So what can be done now? Probably the biggest thing that can be done, I think, is a series of measures to make it untenable for people to stay. So there are various reasons why people come to the US, will work and so on is one. But they don't always work directly. So people may come in and they'll do child minding, or they'll do communal cooking or things like that for the diaspora, so the others can go out to work. So they fill various sort of niches. Now, the work that they're doing isn't value add work or anything like that. It's the lowest of the low paid jobs. In order to exist in a high cost society, which the Western world is, you can only do that working these low paid jobs, particularly if they're under the table payments, which means they'll be even less again than the going wage. The only way you can do this is if you live communally and in large groups. And you see this with Chinese and Indian peasants in Australia, and Hispanic, Mexican people going to the United States, Indians, and that. So they will need to live. There's a certain sort of critical mass of people are needed on those low wages to be able to create if you like, an overall economic unit where they can get by. And that can be 10 people, 15 people, 20, whatever. There needs to be, I think, a crackdown on large numbers of people living in the same house. Now, technically, as in Australia, these laws and bylaws and local ordinances and so on, they do exist. It's just that the governments at whatever level don't enforce them. Local government in particular don't enforce them. So if there are 20 people living to a 2-bedroom apartment, you're supposed to actually say, hey, no, it's a maximum of 5 people. When you get a hotel room, there's a maximum of 3 people in the hotel room, and that is policed quite rigorously. The same goes for rental accommodation or any accommodation, that you're only allowed to have a certain amount of people, certain amount of people per bedroom, and so on. So, for example, in a two-bedroom house, you're only supposed to have 4 people in there. A 2-bedroom apartment, there's 4 people as a maximum. So now maybe if it was 5, you'd turn a blind eye, but when there's 17 in the 2-bedroom apartment, then there's a problem. So these things need to be cracked down on. Now, once they can amortize their costs over large communal groups, which is how they're living communally, then it becomes economically untenable, and so then they would consider, self-deportation would then be rendered an attractive option, because they've gone from quite a low-cost economy where there's not many jobs into a high-cost economy where there are more jobs, but only if they work for well below the tote, well below the card. So that's one thing that could be done. And again, it could be done in Australia. I know people that have gone to their local council, said, look, there's 25 Indians living in that 2-bedroom apartment there, but the council doesn't do anything. They're under instructions to look the other way and to pretend it's not happening. They don't tend to cut as much slack for white people doing it, but certainly brown people working on those labour hire, slave labour type scams that are operating everywhere these days. So that's one thing. And the next thing that can be done, of course, is having heavy fines for any employer who employs illegals. Now, the main employment for illegals isn't, as a lot of people think, white-run companies, although they do involve. It does get to that, but rather companies that are owned and run by other black and brown people. They're primary offenders. They're not the only offenders, but they're primary offenders. So anyone caught doing that will themselves be deported. This is again saying heavy fines if you employ an illegal. If you don't have a legal social security number or tax file number or whatever it is in any given jurisdiction, then you have to you can't employ such a person. There are heavy fines for it. In Australia there are technically at least heavy fines for someone who isn't a citizen or doesn't have a work permit, that type of thing. But again, that can be easily got around by again paying cash under the table or paying people with sort of giving them goods or services in kind. So you give them, technically you're paying them, but they've just got free rent and free food and a free bit of sort of petty cash spending money, and then you don't have to pay, so you can have that. But anyway, heavy fines for those sorts of situations, and that would cause a dry up of employment opportunities. The fines would need to be considerable in order to be a deterrent. So this idea too that say fruit picking and so on, that there's no one's going to pick the fruit if these illegals get sent away. I'm in favour of things like short-term work permits. So you've got a 12-month work permit to pick fruit, and you can come from Mexico. They could be put up in barracks type accommodation, and that's there's nothing wrong with that. And then at the end of the 12 months, they go back to wherever. That's okay. Now they can't repatriate money back to the country of origin until they've completed their 12 months. And I think that should be put in place. But if there are workers that are genuinely needed and market pay rates are being paid, and there is a genuine shortage, which I dispute, by the way, I don't think there is a shortage there, then that should be remittances back to Mexico or I don't know, Guatemala or wherever should be taxed quite heavily, and that in order to claim that back, people have to prove that they've got a work permit or a citizenship or some sort of legal resident status, and if they can't, then that money collected is considered as a fine. So the idea of going to a first world country and living in some community and then sending money back to your family in wherever, India or Mexico or somewhere, that needs to be spent. Now that is a huge issue. If they can't send money back to the family back home, then much of the incentive to come to the US or a first world country is gone if they can't do that. So it's very difficult to get work. They can't live communally, and their remittances are being taxed. This would be, the millions will self-deport on those issues alone. Now, in terms of the criminals, that they would be flushed out automatically by the employment situation there. But many of them maybe are drug dealers or standover merchants parasiting off their own racial diaspora. So there may need to be some sort of a dragnet thing there, and a far more proactive a series of measures to capture these people. Now, as more deportations occur, whether it be self-deportation or not, then the number of the criminals will be a fairly high number in proportion to the total illegals. So over time, they'll become much easier to identify as the number of illegals declines overall. Of course, there are measures to stop illegals coming in. There are other things could be done, such as any student at school that doesn't speak English, their parents have to be interviewed and their legal status determined. Anyone that fronts up at emergency rooms in hospitals, their legal status has to be determined. So there are various other avenues that can be used. Now there are also, there's other layers, like for example, Indians, people coming from India or indeed the subcontinent, or for that matter, the Middle East, Africa too. The Middle East and the subcontinent, they've got a very sort of I don't know, focused view on they will only marry into their own diaspora, and they want to keep their bloodlines pure, and they want to keep their culture pure. So they will only marry brides and husbands from the home country. So, the village of their ancestors, if you like. Now, if they're not allowed to do this, if they're prevented from saying, well, look, you can marry who you want, but if you want to marry some prearranged bride thing in India, then you can't come back to this country for 10 years. But go right ahead if you want to do, make it very unattractive for Indians and again people from the Middle East to marry into their own, not only their own diaspora, but to have these prearranged marriages, because this is absolutely essential and vital, and also is perceived as a huge prestige. You can marry my son or my daughter or whatever, and they've got citizenship in the West, so that automatically then you are giving citizenship to another Western citizen. This is a huge prestige issue huge, absolutely huge in India, and people gag to get onto that bandwagon. But if you cut it off, if you prevent it, and say no, you got to marry someone locally who's born here, or that type of thing, then that will, again, a lot of the Indians won't come. Middle Easterns won't come to the West if that's a requirement. Other measures could be done in terms of radicalization through religious institutions, NGOs that heavily facilitate and conceal and offer illicit employment to illegals. They have to be clamped down on and fined heavily. A lot of the NGOs, the globalist NGOs, offer sham employment to illegals, and so it's in order to give them some sort of a local employment status on these non-existent, do-nothing, don't have to show up jobs, and those things need to also be clamped down on. But then there's an additional inducement. Say, look, there's no point you staying here. You've got no future here as an illegal alien. But look, we'll give you a plane ticket back to Guatemala or something, and here's a couple of $1,000. Like pay for them to go, because that in the end would be worth it. Will there be any downside to mass deportation of illegals? I don't believe so. And the Armageddon type stories that are put around by the globalist media, again, the globalists are the huge sponsors of mass migration. Then I don't believe there is an Armageddon scenario waiting. I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's a moving back to merit-based, efficient, value-add economy, which is good for everybody in the end. Being attached to us today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.